John Smith was a ghost, not in the spectral sense, though sometimes he felt like one, drifting through a world that no longer saw him, a world he no longer deserved. He was the ghost of the speedway, a phantom of roaring engines and cheering crowds, now haunting the alleyways and shadowed corners of a city that had once celebrated him. The bottle clutched in his trembling hand offered a momentary respite, a fleeting escape from the relentless torment of memory. But it was a hollow comfort, a deceptive embrace that tightened its grip with each swallow, leaving him colder and emptier than before. The crash, it replayed in his mind like a broken record. The screech of tires, the sickening crunch of metal, the horrifying realization that his recklessness had cost a life full of promise, a life extinguished in an instant of his making. He huddled deeper into the doorway, the damp cardboard offering little protection against the biting wind. The city lights blurred through a haze of self-pity and cheap liquor. He remembered the flashbulbs, the trophies, the admiring glances. Now, only the scornful stares of passers-by and the gnawing emptiness in his gut kept him company. He had been John Smith, rally champion. Now he was just John, a nameless, faceless derelict, another casualty of a life gone wrong. He pushed away the memories of his wife, her gentle smile, the way her hand fit perfectly in his. He had driven her away with his guilt, with his self-destruction. He didn't deserve her, not after what he had done. A wave of nausea washed over him. He retched, the meager contents of his stomach spilling onto the cold pavement. Humiliation burned in his chest, a familiar ache that mirrored the deeper wound in his soul. He was a disgrace, a failure, a stain on the memory of the man he once was. Sometimes late at night, he would wander towards the old speedway. He would stand outside the gates, listening to the distant rumble of engines, imagining the roar of the crowd, the adrenaline pumping through his veins. But the visions were always followed by the crushing weight of reality, the knowledge that those days were gone, irretrievably lost to the tragedy that haunted him. He tried to avoid looking at his hands. These were the hands that had expertly steered racing machines, the hands that had held trophies aloft in victory. Now they were gnarled and calloused, stained with grime and the residue of despair. They trembled uncontrollably, a constant reminder of his shattered nerves, his broken spirit. He had tried to seek help once. A kind-faced woman from a local charity had offered him shelter, food, a chance to rebuild his life, but he had pushed her away, convinced that he was beyond redemption, that he deserved to suffer. The guilt was a constant companion, a heavy chain that bound him to his past. He was afraid of forgiveness, afraid of hope, afraid of facing the man he used to be. The rain started to fall, a cold, relentless drizzle that seeped into his bones. He closed his eyes, wishing for oblivion, for a release from the torment that consumed him. He was alone, utterly alone, adrift in a sea of regret, the ghost of the speedway, forever haunted by the echoes of a life that had been, and a life that could never be again. The only legacy he felt he deserved was one of pain, of a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones, a reminder of the devastating consequences of reckless choices. He was John Smith, and he was lost, hopelessly, irrevocably lost. Sarah felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach as she watched the disheveled man struggling with the engine of the old sedan. Premium Motors was her sanctuary, a place she'd poured her heart and soul into. It was more than just a repair shop. It was a haven for the community, a place where people came not just to fix their cars, but sometimes their lives. And now, this specter of a man was here, a potential threat to the fragile equilibrium she'd so carefully cultivated. He hadn't said a word when he'd stumbled onto the lot, just collapsed next to the sputtering vehicle like a broken marionette. Sarah had almost called the police, but something in his eyes, a deep-seated weariness that mirrored her own, had stopped her. Now, watching his hands move with a surprising, almost balletic grace, she was intrigued. He swore under his breath, a low, guttural sound that barely registered over the hum of the garage. Then, with a final wrench, the engine coughed, sputtered, and roared back to life. The man straightened up, his face streaked with grease and grime, but a flicker of something, pride, flashed in his eyes before quickly vanishing. "Impressive," Sarah said, approaching him cautiously. Most people would have called a tow truck. He didn't meet her gaze. "Lucky guess," he mumbled, turning away as if to disappear back into the shadows. "Luck or not, you fixed it," she insisted, stepping closer. She noticed the tremor in his hands, the way his shoulders were hunched as if carrying an unbearable weight. "I'm Sarah, by the way. I manage Premium Motors." He finally looked up, his eyes the color of a stormy sea, filled with a pain that seemed to reach into the depths of her own soul. "John, he said, his voice raspy and barely audible. John Smith. John, she repeated, testing the name on her tongue. You've got a real knack for engines. We could use someone like you here. A scoff escaped his lips, a harsh, bitter sound. You don't want me here, trust me. I decide who I want here, John, Sarah said, her voice firm but gentle. And I see something in you, something worth saving. Her words seemed to startle him. He looked at her, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. The skepticism in his eyes slowly gave way to a flicker of something akin to hope, quickly extinguished by a wave of fear. I'm not good for anything, he stammered, his gaze darting around the garage as if looking for an escape route. I'll just mess things up. Everyone messes things up, John, Sarah replied, her voice soft. It's what you do after that matters. We all deserve a second chance. She knew she was taking a risk. Her mechanics, good, reliable men who'd been with her for years, would likely balk at the idea of hiring someone who looked like he'd been living on the streets. But something about John, his raw talent, his obvious pain, resonated with her. I don't know, John mumbled, running a hand through his matted hair. The offer was tempting, a lifeline thrown into the abyss of his despair. But could he trust it? Could he trust himself? Think about it, Sarah said, handing him a card with the Premium Motors logo. The offer's open. We're not looking for perfection, John, just someone willing to try. She watched as he hesitated, his fingers trembling as he took the card. He looked at the address, then back at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. What kind of work? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Mechanic work. Diagnostics, repairs, the usual, Sarah replied, trying to sound casual. We're a family here, John. We help each other out. He looked around the garage, taking in the organized chaos, the camaraderie between the mechanics, the sense of purpose that permeated the air. It was a far cry from the loneliness and despair that had consumed him for so long. I don't have any tools, he said, his voice laced with shame. Sarah smiled. We have plenty. Don't worry about that. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Sarah held her breath, waiting, praying that he would say yes. She knew this was a long shot, a gamble on a broken man, but she couldn't shake the feeling that John Smith was worth fighting for. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Okay, he said, his eyes meeting hers for the first time without flinching. Okay, I'll try. A wave of relief washed over Sarah, so intense it almost brought her to her knees. She had expected resistance, arguments, even outright rejection, but he had said yes. A small hesitant yes, but a yes nonetheless. Great, she said, her voice filled with genuine warmth. Come back tomorrow morning. We start at 8. John nodded, clutching the card in his hand as if it were a lifeline. He turned to leave, then hesitated, turning back to Sarah. Thank you, he mumbled, his voice choked with emotion. For everything. Sarah simply smiled. You're welcome, John. See you tomorrow. As she watched him disappear into the gathering dusk, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of hope, not just for John, but for herself as well. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges and setbacks, but she also knew that sometimes the greatest rewards came from taking the biggest risks, and she had a feeling that John Smith, the ghost of the Speedway, might just be the redemption that Premium Motors, and perhaps even she, desperately needed. She went back inside, the scent of oil and gasoline suddenly smelling a little sweeter, a little more like possibility. The hum of the garage seemed to vibrate with a new energy, a promise of healing and hope. John arrived at Premium Motors precisely at 8 the next morning. The rising sun cast long shadows across the lot, painting the rows of parked cars in hues of gold and amber. He hesitated at the entrance, the scent of oil and rubber hitting him like a physical blow. It was a familiar smell, a smell that had once been synonymous with victory and adrenaline, but now reeked of shattered dreams and crushing guilt. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. He had promised Sarah he would try, and he intended to keep his word. He pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside. The garage was a hive of activity. Mechanics in grease-stained overalls moved with practiced efficiency, the air filled with the clang of wrenches, the hiss of air compressors, and the rumble of engines. John felt a wave of disorientation wash over him. It was all too familiar, yet felt alien at the same time. Sarah spotted him immediately, and her face lit up with a warm smile. "John, good morning. Glad to see you made it." He managed a weak smile in return. "Morning," he mumbled, his voice still raspy. "Let me introduce you to the team," Sarah said, leading him further into the garage. "Guys, this is John Smith. He'll be working with us." A few of the mechanics nodded curtly, their eyes assessing him with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. One man, a burly fellow with a thick mustache and arms covered in tattoos, stepped forward. "Mike," he said, extending a calloused hand, "I'm the head mechanic here." His grip was firm, almost challenging. John shook his hand, feeling the man's scrutiny. "John," he replied simply. Mike's eyes narrowed slightly. "Sarah tells me you've got some experience." "Some," John conceded, avoiding eye contact. "Well, we'll see about that," Mike said, his voice laced with skepticism. "We run a tight ship here. No room for screw-ups." John's jaw tightened. The pressure was already building, the familiar feeling of inadequacy creeping in. He knew he was being judged, not just for his skills, but for his past. Sarah, sensing the tension, stepped in. "Mike, why don't you show John around, get him acquainted with the equipment?" Mike grunted in agreement, leading John towards a cluttered workbench. "This is your station," he said, gesturing dismissively. "Keep it clean, and try not to break anything." As Mike walked away, John felt a surge of anger. He was being treated like a novice, a liability. But he knew he had to prove himself. He had to show them he was more than just a washed-up racing driver. The morning was a blur of frustration and humiliation. John struggled to adapt to the garage's routines and procedures. He fumbled with tools, misread diagrams, and made several rookie mistakes. Each error was met with a disapproving glare from Mike and barely concealed smirks from the other mechanics. The noise and activity of the garage were also triggering, sending flashes of memory through his mind. The screech of tires, the roar of engines, the sickening crunch of metal, it all came flooding back, overwhelming him with guilt and despair. He found himself gripping his tools so tightly, his knuckles turned white, fighting back the urge to run. At one point, while attempting to replace a faulty fuel pump, he completely froze, his hands trembling uncontrollably. The image of the mangled wreckage flashed before his eyes, the screams of the crowd ringing in his ears. He dropped the fuel pump with a clang, the sound echoing through the garage like a gunshot. Mike rushed over, his face contorted with anger. "What the hell are you doing, Smith? Are you trying to blow us all up?" John stood there, paralyzed, unable to speak. He felt like he was drowning, the weight of his past pulling him under. Sarah hurried to his side, her eyes filled with concern. "John, are you okay?" He shook his head, unable to meet her gaze. I can't," he stammered. "I can't do this." Sarah placed a hand on his arm, her touch surprisingly firm. "Yes, you can, John. Just breathe. Take it one step at a time." She led him away from the workbench and towards a quiet corner of the garage. "Sit down for a minute," she said, guiding him to a stool. "Just breathe." John closed his eyes, trying to regain control. He focused on Sarah's voice, on the steady rhythm of her breathing. Slowly, gradually, the panic began to subside. "It's okay to make mistakes, John," Sarah said softly. "Everyone does. The important thing is to learn from them." He opened his eyes, looking at her with a mixture of gratitude and shame. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely audible. I messed up." "It's all right," Sarah reassured him. "We'll fix it. Together." Over the next few days, John continued to struggle, but he also began to show glimpses of his former brilliance. He possessed an innate understanding of mechanics, a natural talent for diagnosing problems and finding solutions. He could listen to an engine and instantly identify the source of the trouble. He could feel the subtle vibrations of a car's chassis and pinpoint the slightest imbalance. Sarah recognized his potential and patiently guided him, offering encouragement and support. She didn't pressure him, but she also didn't let him give up. She gave him simple tasks at first, allowing him to regain his confidence gradually. One afternoon, a customer brought in a classic Mustang with a persistent engine problem that had stumped the other mechanics. Mike had spent hours tinkering with it, but to no avail. Frustrated, he finally threw up his hands in defeat. "It's a lost cause," he declared. "The engine's shot. Tell him to scrap it." Sarah, however, had a different idea. "John," she said, "why don't you take a look?" John hesitated. He knew he was taking a risk, but he also knew he couldn't back down. He spent the next few hours meticulously examining the Mustang's engine, listening to its labored breathing, feeling its erratic pulse. He consulted diagrams, tested circuits, and checked fuel lines. Finally, he identified the problem, a faulty distributor cap. It was a simple fix, but one that had been overlooked by everyone else. He replaced the distributor cap, started the engine, and listened with satisfaction as it purred to life. The Mustang roared back to life, its engine sounding stronger and smoother than it had in years. Mike stared in disbelief. "I'll be damned," he muttered. The customer was ecstatic. He showered John with praise and thanked him profusely. As the Mustang drove away, John felt a sense of accomplishment he hadn't experienced in years. He had used his skills to solve a problem, to bring something back to life. He looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he said, "for believing in me." Sarah smiled. "You did it, John. You did it all yourself." As the days turned into weeks, John began to find his place at Premium Motors. He was still haunted by his past, but he was also starting to heal. He was learning to forgive himself, to accept his imperfections, and to embrace the possibility of a future. The fear and humiliation were still present, but they were now tempered with resilience and hope. He was no longer just a ghost, a shadow of his former self. He was John Smith, the mechanic, the survivor, the man who was finally finding redemption in the roar of engines and the smell of gasoline. He was, slowly but surely, being baptized by fire and emerging stronger on the other side. Sarah's smile lingered in John's mind, a warm beacon against the encroaching darkness of his past. But the satisfaction of a job well done couldn't completely drown out the gnawing anxiety that always seemed to lurk just beneath the surface. He knew this fragile piece could shatter at any moment. The next morning, John arrived at Premium Motors to find his toolbox slightly askew. He frowned. He distinctly remembered leaving it neatly organized. He dismissed it as a minor oversight. Perhaps he was just tired. He shook it off and started working on the day's assignments. As the day progressed, small irritating incidents began to accumulate. A wrench he needed was missing, only to be found later in a completely illogical place. A hose he'd carefully measured was mysteriously cut too short. He noticed Mike watching him from across the shop, a smirk playing on his lips. The final straw came with a classic '67 Corvette Stingray. John had been tasked with tuning its engine. He painstakingly adjusted the carburetor, timing, and ignition, ensuring every component was perfect. He was proud of the work, hearing the engine purr like a kitten. Later that afternoon, the customer returned, furious. "This car is running worse than before," he yelled, his face red with anger. "It's sputtering, stalling, and smells like it's burning oil." John was stunned. He'd personally overseen every detail. He opened the hood and immediately saw the problem. The timing was completely off, and the carburetor was flooded. Someone had deliberately sabotaged his work. He glanced at Mike, who was leaning against a nearby workbench, a barely concealed look of triumph on his face. John's blood began to boil. The old rage, the self-destructive anger he thought he'd buried, threatened to erupt. He clenched his fists, his knuckles white. He wanted to lash out, to confront Mike, to silence the taunting smirk on his face. He remembered Sarah's words, her unwavering belief in him. He remembered the faces of the families affected by his past mistakes. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to regain control. He looked at the customer, his expression a mix of anger and apology. "I'm sorry about this," John said, his voice tight but controlled. "I'll fix it. It shouldn't take long." As he worked to correct the sabotage, he felt Mike's presence looming behind him. "Having a little trouble, Johnny?" Mike sneered. "Maybe this mechanic thing isn't for you. Maybe you should go back to doing what you're good at, crashing cars." The words were like a punch to the gut. The memories flooded back. The roar of the engine, the screech of tires, the sickening crunch of metal, the faces of the injured, the haunted look in his own eyes. He gripped the wrench so tightly his hand ached. "Shut your mouth, Mike," John growled, his voice low and dangerous. "Or what, Johnny?" Mike taunted, stepping closer. "You gonna hurt me? Just like you hurt those people? Maybe you should just walk away before you mess things up for everyone again." John spun around, his eyes blazing. He took a step towards Mike, his fists clenched. He was on the precipice, teetering on the edge of losing everything he'd worked so hard to rebuild. Suddenly, Sarah stepped between them. Her eyes were blazing with fury. "That's enough, Mike," she snapped, her voice sharp and commanding. "I won't tolerate this kind of behavior in my shop." Mike backed down, his bravado fading under Sarah's intense gaze. "I was just—" he stammered. "I heard everything," Sarah interrupted. "You're jealous, Mike. You're jealous that John is a better mechanic than you, and you're trying to tear him down to make yourself feel better." She turned to John, her expression softening. "Don't listen to him, John. He's just trying to get under your skin. You're doing great work, and I'm proud to have you on my team." She looked back at Mike, her voice icy. "And as for you, Mike, I expect an apology. Now." Mike mumbled an insincere apology, avoiding eye contact. Sarah glared at him for a moment longer, then turned back to John. "Finish fixing that Corvette," she said, her voice gentle. "I know you can do it." As John returned to his work, he felt a surge of gratitude towards Sarah. She had stood up for him, defended him against Mike's malicious attacks. Her belief in him was a lifeline, a reminder that he wasn't alone in his struggle. But the incident had shaken him. It had exposed the raw, festering wounds of his past, and it had revealed the depth of Mike's resentment. He knew this was just the beginning. The battle for his redemption had just begun, and the road ahead would be long and arduous. He tightened his grip on the wrench, his resolve hardening. He wouldn't let Mike or his past destroy him. He would prove them all wrong. He would find redemption not in the roar of a race car engine, but in the quiet satisfaction of a job well done, in the trust of a friend, and in the unwavering belief in a better future. The fear hadn't disappeared, but it was now accompanied by a fierce determination, a burning desire to prove that he was more than just a broken man. He was John Smith, the mechanic, the survivor, and he was ready to fight for his second chance. He carefully adjusted the carburetor, his movements precise and deliberate, the sounds of the garage fading into the background as he focused on the task at hand. The engine sputtered, then roared to life, sounding stronger and smoother than ever before. He had won this battle, but the war was far from over. Sarah watched John as he tinkered with the Corvette, a familiar ache tugging at her heart. She knew his past haunted him, a shadow clinging to his every move. Mike's constant needling only made it worse, stirring up demons best left undisturbed. She'd seen the flicker of rage in John's eyes, the tight clenching of his jaw, and she feared he might unravel. That's why she intervened, why she defended him. He deserved a second chance, a chance to prove he was more than the sum of his mistakes. The next morning, a battered, cherry-red 1967 Mustang Fastback was towed into the shop. It was a classic, a beauty even in its current state of disrepair. A young woman with tear-stained eyes followed the tow truck, her face etched with worry. She approached Sarah hesitantly. This was my dad's," she said, her voice cracking. "He loved this car more than anything. We used to work on it together. He passed away last month." Sarah's heart went out to her. "I'm so sorry for your loss." The young woman swallowed hard, fighting back tears. "The engine, it just died. The mechanic my uncle took it to said it's beyond repair. He said it's scrap metal, but this car, it's everything to me. It's all I have left of my dad." Sarah placed a comforting hand on her arm. "Let me take a look. We have a mechanic here who's pretty good with engines. John, could you come over here for a minute?" John emerged from under a lift, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He looked at the Mustang, then at the young woman, his expression softening. He recognized the pain in her eyes, the same pain he carried within himself. "What's the problem?" he asked gently. "They said the engine's dead," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "Completely dead." John knelt down, examining the engine compartment. He ran his hand along the cold metal, his touch surprisingly tender. He could see the years of love and care that had been poured into this car. He could almost feel the presence of the father and daughter who had shared countless hours working on it together. "Let's take a look inside," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. He spent the next few hours meticulously disassembling the engine, carefully examining each part. Sarah watched him, impressed by his focus and his quiet expertise. He wasn't just a mechanic, he was an artist, a surgeon, breathing life back into something that had been declared dead. As he worked, the young woman sat nearby, watching him with a mixture of hope and apprehension. She told him stories about her father, about their adventures in the Mustang, about the memories they had created together. John listened intently, his own past echoing in her words. He understood her grief, her desperation to hold on to this last tangible connection to her father. Finally, after hours of painstaking work, John straightened up, his face covered in grease but his eyes shining with a newfound light. "It's not dead," he said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "It's hurt, but it's not dead. I think I can fix it." The young woman's face lit up, tears welling in her eyes. "Really? You can? Oh, thank you. Thank you so much." John nodded. "It's going to take some time, and it's not going to be cheap. But I promise you, I'll do everything I can to bring it back to life." Over the next few weeks, John poured his heart and soul into the Mustang. He worked late into the night, often staying long after everyone else had gone home. He meticulously cleaned, repaired, and replaced each part, his movements precise and deliberate. He sourced rare and hard-to-find components, scouring junkyards and online forums, determined to restore the engine to its original glory. Sarah watched him, amazed by his dedication. She saw a change in him, a softening around the edges. He was still haunted by his past, but he was also finding a sense of purpose, a sense of redemption, in helping this young woman. One evening, as John was working on the Mustang, Sarah approached him. "You know," she said, "you're not just fixing a car, you're fixing a heart." John looked up, his eyes meeting hers. He knew she was right. He wasn't just restoring an engine, he was restoring a connection, a memory, a piece of someone's life. And in doing so, he was also beginning to heal his own wounds. The day finally arrived when the engine was ready to be started. The young woman, whose name was Emily, stood beside John, her hands clasped tightly together, her eyes filled with anticipation. Sarah watched from a distance, a lump forming in her throat. John took a deep breath, turned the key, and the engine sputtered, coughed, and then roared to life. The sound filled the garage, a powerful, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate through everyone's bones. Emily gasped, tears streaming down her face. It's alive!" she cried, her voice filled with joy. "It sounds just like it used to." She threw her arms around John, hugging him tightly. Thank you. You have no idea what this means to me." John hugged her back, a genuine smile spreading across his face. He felt a sense of accomplishment, a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in years. He had done something good, something meaningful. He had used his skills to bring joy to someone else, to help them heal. As Emily drove the Mustang out of the garage, the engine purring like a contented cat, John watched her go, a sense of hope blossoming in his chest. He knew he still had a long way to go, but he was finally on the right path. He was no longer just a broken man haunted by his past. He was John Smith, the mechanic, the survivor, the healer. He was a man who had found redemption in the most unexpected of places, in the roar of an engine, and the gratitude in a young woman's eyes. He looked over to Sarah, a silent thank you passing between them. He knew he couldn't have done it without her. Her faith in him, her unwavering support, had given him the strength to face his demons and to find his way back to the light. He was ready to face whatever the future held, knowing that he was no longer alone. He had Sarah, he had his work, and he had a purpose, and that was enough. The celebratory air in the garage was short-lived. As John began tidying his tools, a palpable tension crackled in the air. Mike stood by the entrance to the office, a smug look plastered on his face. Well, Mike drawled, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "It looks like our resident hero pulled another rabbit out of his hat. Impressive, John, very impressive. Almost makes one forget the incident." John froze, his back stiffening. Sarah, who had been beaming at John, felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. She knew what was coming. "What incident, Mike?" Sarah challenged, stepping forward. "John just fixed a car that no one else could. He brought a lot of joy to Emily. What's your problem?" Mike chuckled, a harsh, unpleasant sound. "Oh, Sarah, always the knight in shining armor. You really have a soft spot for this guy, don't you? But shouldn't you know who you're defending? Shouldn't everyone here know?" He gestured towards the office, then back at the gathered mechanics. "Let's just say John's past isn't as squeaky clean as he'd like you all to believe. He wasn't always fixing cars, you know. He was a racer." A murmur went through the garage. John remained silent, his gaze fixed on the floor. "A racer," Mike continued, his voice rising. "And not just any racer, a champion. Until the accident. The one that cost a young driver his life. The one that ended John Smith's career in a blaze of glory." The air in the garage grew thick with shock. John's secret was out. The truth, which he had so desperately tried to bury, was now exposed for everyone to see. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She knew John had a past, that he was haunted by something, but she had never imagined it was this. "That's not true," she whispered, her voice trembling. Mike laughed again. "Oh, it's true, Sarah, all true. Just do a little digging. It's all there. John Smith, the fallen idol, the man who took a life." He turned his attention back to John. "So, John, why don't you tell them? Tell them about the crash. Tell them about the young man who died. Tell them how you walked away, relatively unscathed, while his family mourned." John finally looked up, his eyes filled with pain and shame. "Stop it, Mike," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Stop it. Why? Shouldn't they know? Shouldn't they know who they're working with, a killer?" Mike's words were like daggers, each one piercing John's heart. He felt the weight of his past crushing him, suffocating him. He wanted to disappear, to vanish into thin air. "I didn't mean for it to happen," John said, his voice cracking. "It was an accident. An accident that took a life," Mike sneered. "An accident that you caused." The silence in the garage was deafening. Everyone was staring at John, their faces a mixture of shock, disbelief, and suspicion. Sarah stepped forward again, her eyes blazing with anger. "Mike, that's enough. You're being cruel and heartless. Whatever happened in the past, John is a different person now. He's trying to make amends." "Make amends?" Mike scoffed. "By fixing cars? That's not going to bring anyone back, Sarah. Suddenly, the young woman, Emily, whose Mustang John had just restored, stepped forward. Her eyes were red and puffy from crying, but her voice was clear and strong. "He helped me," she said, her gaze fixed on John. "He helped me heal. My dad loved that car, and when it broke down, it felt like I was losing him all over again. John gave me back a piece of him. He gave me back hope." She walked over to John and took his hand. "Thank you, John. Thank you for everything." Her words seemed to break the spell. Other mechanics began to murmur their support for John. Mike, seeing that his plan was backfiring, stormed out of the garage, muttering curses under his breath. The tension in the garage eased slightly, but the damage had been done. John felt exposed and vulnerable, like a raw nerve. He knew that he couldn't stay here, not after this. He had to leave. He pulled his hand away from Emily's and turned to Sarah, his eyes filled with despair. "I have to go," he said, his voice barely audible. "I can't stay here anymore." Sarah's heart sank. She couldn't bear the thought of John leaving. She had seen the good in him, the potential for redemption. She knew that he was a good man despite his past. "John, please don't go," she pleaded, her voice thick with emotion. "Don't let Mike win. Don't let your past define you." Emily stepped forward again. "You can't leave, John," she said, her voice firm. "You have to stay. You're helping people. You're making a difference." John looked at Sarah, then at Emily. He saw the hope in their eyes, the gratitude in their faces. He realized that he wasn't just fixing cars. He was fixing lives. He was giving people hope, just like he had given Emily hope. He took a deep breath, his shoulders slumping. I don't know," he said, his voice wavering. Sarah walked over to him and took his hand, her touch warm and reassuring. "John, you're not the man you were before. You've changed. You've found redemption. Don't let anyone take that away from you. Don't let your past control your future." She looked into his eyes, her gaze filled with love and compassion. "We believe in you, John. We know you can do this. We know you can face your past and build a better future." John looked at Sarah, her words resonating within him. He knew that she was right. He couldn't run away from his past. He had to face it. He had to confront his demons and prove to himself and to everyone else that he was worthy of redemption. He took another deep breath, his gaze hardening with determination. "Okay," he said, his voice stronger now. "Okay, I'll stay, but I'm not going to hide anymore. I'm going to face my past head on. I'm going to show everyone that I'm not the man they think I am." A small smile spread across Sarah's face. "That's the John I know," she said, squeezing his hand. Emily smiled too, her eyes shining with hope. "Thank you, John," she said. "Thank you for staying." John looked at them, his heart filled with gratitude. He knew that he had a long way to go, but he wasn't alone. He had Sarah, he had Emily, and he had the support of the other mechanics in the garage. He had a purpose, a reason to keep fighting. He was John Smith, the mechanic, the survivor, the healer, and he was ready to face whatever the future held, knowing that he was finally on the path to redemption. The road ahead would be difficult, but he was no longer afraid. He had found his purpose, and he would not let anything stand in his way. John stared at the cracked concrete floor of his garage, the weight of Sarah and Emily's belief a heavy but welcome burden. He knew what he had to do. Running wouldn't solve anything. Facing it, facing her, was the only way to truly begin to heal. The widow. He hadn't spoken her name aloud in years, hadn't allowed himself to dwell on the image of her face, etched with grief. He looked up at Sarah, her hand still warm in his. I need to see her," he said, the words catching in his throat. "I need to talk to her, to apologize, to face what I did." Sarah squeezed his hand tighter. Dread clouded her features, but beneath it, he saw understanding and a quiet strength. "Are you sure, John? This will be hard." He nodded, his jaw tight. "I'm sure. It's time." The drive to her house was a blur. Every mile marker seemed to scream his past failures, his past mistakes. He replayed the accident in his mind, the roar of the engines, the sickening crunch of metal, the sudden, deafening silence. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He found her address, a small, unassuming bungalow with a neatly manicured lawn. A swing set stood silently in the backyard, a poignant reminder of what could have been. He parked the truck, his heart hammering against his ribs. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his trembling hands. He walked to the door and raised his hand to knock, hesitating for a moment. What could he possibly say? How could he ever atone for the pain he had caused? He swallowed hard and knocked. The door opened slowly, revealing a woman with tired eyes and lines etched around her mouth that spoke of years of sorrow. He recognized her immediately. Even after all this time, Mrs. Harding. Her eyes widened in shock, then narrowed with suspicion and a simmering rage. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice cold and brittle. John's throat constricted. "Mrs. Harding," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "My name is John Smith. I was the driver in the accident." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken grief and accusation. Her face hardened, her eyes blazing with anger. "You!" she spat, her voice rising in pitch. "You're the one who killed my husband. What are you doing here? How dare you show your face here?" He flinched, the words like a physical blow. He deserved her anger, deserved her hatred. He had robbed her of her husband, her life. "I know," he said, his voice trembling. "I know I can never undo what I did. I know I can never bring him back, but I'm here to say I'm sorry, truly sorry. I take full responsibility for what happened. It was my fault." Tears streamed down her face, a mixture of grief and fury. "Sorry? Sorry isn't going to bring him back. Sorry isn't going to fill the hole in my life. You took everything from me." He lowered his head, unable to meet her gaze. "I know," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion, "and I understand if you can never forgive me. I don't deserve it. But I needed to tell you face to face how deeply sorry I am." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with genuine remorse. "I've lived with this guilt every day since. It's haunted me, and I know that doesn't even begin to compare to the pain you've endured." She stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. The anger in her eyes slowly began to dissipate, replaced by a flicker of something else, something akin to pity. "Why now?" she asked, her voice softer now, but still laced with pain. "Why come here after all these years?" He took a deep breath. "Because I've been running from it, from you, for too long. I've been hiding, but I realize that running isn't the answer. Facing it, facing you, is the only way to start to heal." He continued, his voice cracking with emotion. "I know it doesn't excuse what I did, but I've tried to make something good come out of it. I work in a garage now, fixing cars, and I try to help people, to use my skills to make a difference." He gestured vaguely. "It's not much, but it's the only way I know how to honor his memory, to honor the life I took." She was silent for a long time, studying his face, searching for any sign of insincerity. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can ever forgive you," she said, her voice shaking. "What you did, it changed my life forever. It took away my happiness, my future. But," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "I see the remorse in your eyes. I see that you're truly sorry, and maybe someday I can find a way to forgive you. Not for you, but for myself, to finally let go of the anger and the pain." A single tear rolled down John's cheek. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for even considering it." He knew he had a long way to go, that forgiveness was a journey, not a destination, but for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope, a sliver of light in the darkness. He had taken the first step, he had faced his ghost. He turned to leave, but she stopped him. "Wait," she said. "What happened to racing?" He hesitated, the question bringing back a flood of painful memories. "I couldn't," he said, his voice low. "I couldn't get behind the wheel again, not after what happened." She nodded, understanding dawning in her eyes. "I understand," she said. Maybe that's your penance, living with the consequences of your actions." He looked at her, his heart filled with gratitude. "Maybe you're right," he said. "Maybe it is." He turned and walked back to his truck, his steps lighter than they had been in years. The road ahead would still be long and difficult, but he was no longer alone. He had taken the first step on the path to redemption, and that, he knew, was all that mattered. He started the engine and drove away, leaving behind the house, the widow, and the ghosts of his past. He knew he would never forget, but he also knew that he could finally begin to heal. The burden of guilt was still there, but it felt a little lighter, a little more bearable. He had faced the darkness, and he had found a glimmer of light. He had found hope, and that was enough to keep him going. As he drove, he thought of Sarah and Emily, their unwavering belief in him. He knew he had to be worthy of their faith, worthy of the second chance he had been given. He had to prove to them and to himself that he was more than just a racing champion, more than just a man haunted by his past. He was John Smith, the mechanic, the survivor, the healer. And he was ready to face whatever the future held, knowing that he was finally on the right path. John returned to his garage, the scent of oil and metal a comforting balm to his wounded spirit. Sarah was there, sweeping the floor with a purposeful energy that always seemed to calm him. He watched her for a moment, the simple act of her work radiating a quiet strength. "You okay?" she asked, her eyes meeting his. They held a depth of understanding that words couldn't capture. He nodded slowly. "I think so." It was hard, but I think she might be starting to understand. Sarah leaned on the broom, her gaze unwavering. "Forgiveness takes time, John. Don't expect it to happen overnight." He knew she was right. He'd been carrying the weight of his guilt for so long, he couldn't expect it to simply vanish. "There was something else," he said hesitantly. "A racing team. They saw me working on the miller's car. They were impressed." Sarah's eyebrows rose. "Impressed enough to offer me a job," he finished. "Head mechanic. They need someone with experience, someone who knows the ins and outs of racing machines." A flicker of hope ignited in Sarah's eyes, but it was quickly shadowed by concern. "John, that's a big step. Are you sure you're ready? Being back in that world." He looked down at his hands, calloused and stained with grease. The memories of the track, the roar of the engines, the adrenaline rush, they were all still there, buried beneath layers of regret. "That's what I'm afraid of," he admitted. "That it'll pull me back in, that I'll forget everything I've learned." He looked up at her, pleading for understanding. "I don't want to become that person again, Sarah. The one who only cared about winning, who pushed the limits too far." Sarah stepped closer, her hand gently touching his arm. "You're not that person anymore, John. You've changed. You've faced your demons and you're fighting to be better. This could be your chance to use your knowledge, your skills, to make a real difference." "But what if I fail?" he whispered, the fear creeping back in. "What if I make another mistake? What if something happens again?" Sarah squeezed his arm, her voice firm but gentle. "You won't. Not this time. You'll be there to ensure the safety of those young drivers, to teach them what you've learned the hard way. You can turn your pain into something positive, John, something that honors the memory of those we've lost." He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the unwavering faith she had in him. It was a faith he wasn't sure he deserved, but it was a faith he desperately needed. He thought of the young drivers, eager and ambitious, just like he had been. He thought of the potential for accidents, the devastating consequences of recklessness. He thought of Mrs. Harding and the pain he had caused. "I could teach them," he said, his voice gaining strength. "I could show them the importance of safety, of responsibility. I could make sure they understand the risks, the consequences." He paused, a new resolve hardening his gaze. "I could make sure no one else has to go through what Mrs. Harding went through." A slow smile spread across Sarah's face. "That's it, John. That's the spirit. This isn't just about racing, it's about redemption. It's about using your past to build a better future." He took a deep breath, the fear slowly receding, replaced by a growing sense of purpose. "Okay," he said, his voice firm. "I'll do it. I'll take the job." Sarah wrapped her arms around him, her embrace filled with warmth and support. "I knew you would," she whispered. "I'm so proud of you." He held her close, feeling the weight of his past lifting, replaced by the lightness of hope. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he wasn't alone. He had Sarah, he had Emily, and he had a chance to make a difference. He thought of the racing team, the young drivers, the opportunity to mentor and guide. He knew he couldn't erase the past, but he could use it to shape the future. He could transform his pain into a legacy of hope and healing. And as he stood there, in the heart of his garage, surrounded by the tools of his trade, he knew that he was finally on the right track. The track to redemption, the track to a new life, the track to healing. He would make sure that the team was in the best condition possible and teach the drivers everything he knew. Safety would be the #1 priority. He would not let anyone else get hurt. He would pour every ounce of his knowledge and dedication into this team, ensuring that they had the best equipment and training possible. His past mistakes would serve as a constant reminder of the importance of caution and responsibility. He would be a mentor, a teacher, and a protector. And maybe, just maybe, he could finally find peace. Years melted away like snow under the desert sun. John, once a pariah haunted by the ghost of his past, became a respected figure, a beacon of integrity in the often cutthroat world of racing. His hands, once trembling with guilt, now moved with a sure, steady grace, coaxing the maximum performance from roaring engines while never compromising on safety. He poured his soul into the racing team, not just as their mechanic, but as their mentor. He saw in the young drivers a reflection of his younger self, the ambition, the recklessness, the burning desire to win. But he also saw the potential for something more, something better. He taught them not just about horsepower and aerodynamics, but about responsibility, about the weight of their decisions, about the human cost of mistakes. He visited Sarah regularly, his heart overflowing with gratitude. Her unwavering belief in him had been the anchor he desperately needed. "I don't know where I'd be without you, Sarah," he'd often say, his voice thick with emotion. "You saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself." Sarah would simply smile, her eyes twinkling with warmth. "I just saw the good man you always were, John. You just needed a little help finding him again." He also started making regular visits to Emily, finding solace in their quiet conversations. She had forgiven him long ago, but he still needed to hear it, needed to know that the woman most affected by his actions held no malice in her heart. With each visit, the weight on his shoulders lessened, the darkness in his soul began to dissipate. John's story became an inspiration, whispered in hushed tones in the pit lanes and garages. He was living proof that redemption was possible, that even the deepest wounds could heal, that even the most devastating mistakes could be turned into something positive. He showed them that true strength wasn't just about speed and skill, but about character and compassion. One sunny afternoon, John stood in the pit lane, his eyes fixed on the track. A young driver, barely out of his teens, was tearing around the circuit, his car a blur of color and speed. John had taken this young man under his wing, teaching him everything he knew, not just about racing, but about life. He had instilled in him the importance of safety, the value of integrity, the power of forgiveness. The young driver crossed the finish line, taking the checkered flag. The crowd erupted in cheers, a cacophony of noise and excitement. John felt a lump in his throat, his eyes welling up with tears. It wasn't just the thrill of victory, it was something more profound. It was the culmination of years of struggle, years of pain, years of searching for redemption. As the young driver climbed out of his car, he ran straight to John, throwing his arms around him in a bear hug. "I couldn't have done it without you, John," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "You're the best." John smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached all the way to his eyes. He ruffled the young man's hair, feeling a surge of pride and gratitude. He had done it. He had finally found peace. He had transformed his pain into a legacy of hope and healing. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, John stood alone in his garage, the scent of oil and metal filling the air. He looked around at the familiar tools, the gleaming cars, the trophies and accolades that lined the walls. He had come a long way from the broken, guilt-ridden man he once was. He thought of Sarah, of Emily, of the young drivers he had mentored. He thought of the lives he had touched, the hope he had inspired. He knew that he could never completely erase the past, but he could use it to build a better future. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, feeling the peace settle over him like a warm blanket. He had finally found his purpose, his meaning, his redemption. He was no longer just a mechanic, he was a healer, a mentor, a beacon of hope. And as he stood there, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, he knew that he had finally come home. His journey was complete. The mechanic had finally fixed himself, and in doing so, had fixed so much more. The legacy he would leave was not one of speed and glory, but one of compassion, forgiveness, and the enduring power of the human spirit to overcome even the darkest of tragedies. And that, he realized, was a victory worth more than any championship.